The Tech Policy Design Institute acknowledges and pays our respects to all First Nations people. We recognise and celebrate that among many things, Indigenous people were Australia's first tech innovators. Welcome to Tech Mirror. I'm Johanna Weaver, one of the co-founders here at the Tech Policy Design Institute. I am fascinated by a truth that is easily lost in the noise of our daily news feeds. And that is that technology is made by people, which means that it can be made differently. And on this podcast, I get to sit down with big thinkers to explore the ideas and the debates that are shaping technology that is shaping our lives. And I'm interested in how we can use policy as a tool to shape that technology. So let's dive into today's discussions. In today's episode, we're going to talk to a number of Australians who were on the ground at the AI Action Summit in Delhi last week. Now, this conference was one of the world's largest gatherings of AI experts, and it's the fourth summit in a series that started back in 2023. The first iteration of the summit, some of us may remember, was at Bletchley Park in the UK, and it was first convened back then when there was growing concern about this existential risk that frontier artificial intelligence poses to humanity. Since then, the conference has been held in a few different locations around the world. In Seoul, it retained largely the safety focus. Then we went to Paris, where there was a shift from safety to action, and to Delhi, where action has moved to impact, or at least the title has. And the objective of this conversation is to unpack a little bit of what it was like on the ground at a conference this big. So the organisers are saying there was 85 different countries represented, over 100,000 delegates. And so reflecting that, we have an unreasonably large number of delegates here on this call. And we're going to start by asking each of you to just help us to create a picture of what the mood was like on the ground. So I'll go one by one, get each of you to introduce yourselves as well. But it doesn't have to be tech related. Just what's a story that you have that kind of helps capture the mood for those of us who weren't there of what it was actually like to be in Delhi last week? Jess, let's go with you first. So Jess, CEO of Good Things, which is a not-for-profit foundation. Jess, what's your mood-setting story for us?
Oh, look, it just felt so enormous to be there. I think the biggest thing was arriving the first day at the Impact Summit, travelled through all of the Delhi traffic, but actually turning up and the number of people just waiting to get in was significant. It was huge. But, interestingly, the ladies only line, because there is a ladies only line to get through the security, was a lot shorter than the men's lines. And so that was one of the things that I think is always interesting as a woman in the tech space to realise that there are a lot less of you. But I got to meet some great people. And that's one of the things that I think also happened is that everybody wanted to talk to you. Everybody wanted to say, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm here for. And this is why I'm here. So I met an amazing woman in the line that's doing great social impact work in AI. So, that's the kind of mood. It was a lot of energy, a bit of chaos, but real positivity.
David, perhaps if you can introduce yourself and then what's your reflections?
Thanks, Johanna. Yeah, David Masters. I'm the head of global public policy at Atlassian and also a deputy board director as well. I think there was just this tremendous entrepreneurial spirit from all the people that attended. So Lizzie and I were having a chat, which was sort of trending towards a deep and meaningful about our shared Catholicism, but I'll leave that aside. But we were approached by this gentleman who just started launching into speech about what he was doing. And I think in 5 minutes, he didn't take a breath and basically, I think, used every acronym and industry standard known to man. And basically, I still don't know exactly what it is that he did, but it was quite the sales pitch. It was just incredible activity, interest, from the Indian population, wanting to know about AI and wanting to know how they could benefit from it.
Let's go next to Lizzie O'Shea, Chair of Digital Rights Watch.
That's me, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to defend myself against an allegation that I might be a practicing Catholic, which I'm not. But it was more a conversation about lapsed Catholicism, thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, Alondra Nelson, who many of you may know, she was a key drafter of the AI Bill of Rights under the Biden administration. I think it was the last session of the whole summit. She made the observation that she's been to many AI conferences in her time, many, many, many. And this was the first one that had actually invited the community in. So a lot of the chaos was framed as this quite negative thing, like it's hard to get around, it's hard to get things started on time. But I thought that openness was a nice reset on understanding how these things usually occur. So whether that's a meaningful engagement from the public, we have to ask questions about that. Like, what is the purpose in getting lots of people to come? What kind of vibe was Modi going for, I think, in specifically framing it in that way? But I do think Alondra's observation in that respect was a valuable one worth thinking about.
Nick Davis, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Johanna. So Nick Davis, I'm the co-director at the UTS Human Technology Institute, really building on Jess, David and Lizzie, that vibe of interest and engagement from the kind of local population, like the people who were there, particularly from Monday through to Wednesday. And I had my big role as part of the research symposium on the Wednesday. One of the things that I really took away was I was expecting a more of a safety discussion, even despite that your intro and the shift away from that wording in the title. I spend a lot of time with those folks at the international level. But actually, I got a much more of a social discussion and just a lot of questions that revealed the anxiety that people have in India and by extension in the rest of the South around the impact of AI on their jobs, on their livelihoods. Two quick examples. A lot of students, engineering students, came up to me and said, I don't think I'm going to get a job because I'm a software developer and I'm really worried about the rate of progress in coding. And then I had someone who ran a process offshoring business, like a kind of an outsourcing business, come up to me and saying, I've lost half my work, what do I do? It has taken away this overseas stream of income for my business. How do I adapt? And so those kind of that social impact, the economic impact, as well as the opportunity were really, you could see it in people's eyes. And that was the benefit. It wasn't just experts and folk talking to one another. It was that population who were being affected, who were in the room for the first time for one of these summits.
Mm-hmm. Meredith, so TIPT's very own representation on the ground. What's your sort of scene setter for us?
Hi, I'm Meredith Hodgman, Head of Strategy from the Tech Policy Design Institute. I suppose, not unlike the others, the conference was so massive, it was a little bit of a choose-your-own adventure, and at times felt like it was perhaps 2 or 3 different conferences happening at once in parallel. But certainly in the conversations that I was participating in that were mostly government-focused, it was really ambitious, but also very sovereignty-focused. So much of the conversation still really circulated around possession, whether that's about domestic models or national infrastructure or asset ownership, etc. It was always really framed as binary at the beginning, really something that you have or something that you don't. However, of course, we were there talking about our recent publication, the AI agency tool, which was received really, really well, I thought, and really situated that conversation more around control and put it in more of a broad strategic framework. So with that in mind, it was actually really a lot easier to have more honest conversations about the harder structural questions. And you really could see people leaning in towards those nuances, particularly around more difficult questions like persistent rent channels or contradictory copyright settings and the risk of hollowing out state capability, etc. And so I really was quite pleased about the mood being so welcoming towards greater depth in conversation about how the middle powers preserve leverage, particularly through coherent policy settings and collaborative positioning.
So I think that's some good grounding for us. Can you just give us a sense of, like, perhaps, Jess, I'll throw this one to you. You wake up in the morning, what happens next? Because it's also the dispersion of it. Like, how are you choosing where you were going? How many different venues are you going to? I want the listeners to really have a sense of the scale of this event, because it's not just a conference, it took over the whole city.
Yeah, it absolutely took over the whole city. I mean, number one, you had to work out how you were going to get to where you needed to be. So making sure you had, you'd chosen whether you're going to use an Uber or you'd booked a car or any of those things is really, really important. So how you were going to get places. And I also was really, I'd offer to take people places if I had a car. Like, come with me. It's okay. We can get that together. But I think, I'm really interested in social impact. And so what are the benefits of AI and what are the tools that are being used for positive social impact in a multiple different areas? So that was really the stream that I was most interested in. And I think there was a significant number, and I was really positively surprised, I suppose, about not only people just talking about the potential of AI to benefit social impacts, but actually seeing some of those examples of how people have used large language models alongside community intelligence. So bringing those two things together to kind of think about how do you do this and predict when flooding is going to hit a particular area and how do you support people to respond to that. So I think for me, the focus on social impact was really important. So there were a lot of different side sessions that were happening every day. And so I suppose you had to kind of work out, well, where am I going to be today? I was going to go back to the summit on Thursday, but of course couldn't get there because it was all shut down for all of the keynote speakers, Macron and Modi and everyone. So I think you kind of had to be a bit flexible. So I think, being flexible and just knowing there was a lot to be part of anyway.
When this conference first started in the Bletchley Park context, right, it was pretty much just government. It was a relatively small number of people. 28 countries were represented, but by sort of 3 or 4 people from each country. And it's just the explosion of it is quite extraordinary. Let's focus in a little bit more on the outcome, so what your key takeouts were. And part of the reason why we do have so many wonderful guests on this episode is because we really wanted to have the diversity of perspectives, just also so that we're showing the diversity of the conversations that were happening. So David, why don't we start with you? What's your key takeout in terms of the tech policy substance of the conversations that you were having?
Yeah, look, it's clear that India was trying to sell its vision of digital public infrastructure, and that sort of flavoured a lot of the conversation. I think that's a very different conversation that you would have, outside of the Global South, being the first sort of summit that was held in the Global South. And I think if you look at that sort of dynamic in terms of technology rollouts, you probably have seen a dynamic where governments in the Global South have tried to control or have more of a role in rolling out technologies than you have, say, in sort of Western economies. And so I think that certainly flavoured it. I think related to that, there is, to Meredith's point, an interesting conversation around sovereignty, but also like everyone is talking about slightly different things when they talk about sovereignty. And so there were some talking about, owning the full stack of AI infrastructure and software. Others, it was about maintaining control of the data within their jurisdiction, by extension, having some control over the AI outputs. On the digital public infrastructure point, a key role for governments in kind of managing that rollout, ensuring that you don't sort of amplify digital divide issues, ensuring that you have a democratized access. And another perspective is really, it's about sort of domestic capability. Like, do you have people that can develop AI technologies and exploit them? So it just reaffirmed to me that sovereignty has become a really problematic term. And I actually commend, Tipti's sort of use of AI agency, because I think we need to find language around that, because I think everyone is using that term to mean very different things.
Mm. And Lizzie, what about for you?
What I would say is that this summit has some shifting or slightly unclear ambitions and audiences. So that has changed, as you pointed out, since the first one that took place at Bletchley Park. But even now, the communications that came out of this summit from delegates really related to investment in the industry. So what it looked like to me is a dialogue between states and also a chance for them to talk to industry and then stitch up deals, whatever it may be. It can be framed less cynically than that, but certainly that's what comes out of the stated communications. Civil society, and if we use that term broadly to include academic organisations, think tanks, as well as advocacy organisations like mine, of which there were very few in the latter category there at all, none of us really are part of that main stage conversation. None of us were on that stage when Modi is standing there with a bunch of tech CEOs and putting their hands in the air, even if Sam and Daria couldn't manage to hold hands. So what I would say is there are ways in which this whole summit is designed to avoid taking account of the harms, the concerns that people have. And if you want to make them part of this summit, you really have to force your way on. So you have to find ways to create events to do that, to have dialogues that you convene to do that. But you're going to be swimming against the tide if you're doing that work. And, people in this group that we're talking to now were part of doing that. But it's also fair to say that that is not where the main conversation is happening. That worries me. So the conversations I witnessed were incredibly different to the conversations I witness in my day-to-day work as an advocate. I can give you examples of that if it's useful. But
Please,
there's
yeah.
so the one that's most obvious that comes to mind is I went along to one on AI safety and children, and partly because there was a rep from OpenAI there to speak about this. And I'm interested in that because Australia's obviously got a very sophisticated approach to safety and young people. And the conversation, particularly the contributions of the rep from OpenAI, did not discuss harms. In fact, they were applauded, right? So applauded for offering the opportunity to create bespoke educational resources for people. And OpenAI was also applauded for having differential presentations or user experiences based on age. So essentially a form of age management, none of which was transparent or explained or clear, right? So no one talked about the suicides that have been attributed to OpenAI or the growing movement to hold OpenAI responsible for this product, like whether it will succeed or not. There's a lot of consternation among parents associated with the use of these kinds of technology, right? So even if you don't agree with it, that conversation is not even canvassed or part of it, right? So that is important to note. The purpose of these summits is still shifting and shaping. I think there's a role to play in civil society and trying to do work to reshape it. But at the moment, I think a lot of the questions around harms, around returning impact to people in local communities, giving local communities a say in how this technology unfolds, they're not part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say from my perspective as well, watching, even if you just map the communiques, so the Bletchley Park communique, which was very much about, okay, we need to get the science, we need the international science reports. It was the establishment of that committee. And then Seoul was the establishment of the safety institutes. Paris became less substantive. And the communique that has come out of the Indian summit really has got very, very little in it in terms of how we're actually going to be shaping this technology for the benefit of humanity, which is obviously Tipti's mission, but very much aligned in terms of a lot of what you were saying there, Lizzie. And just to reinforce, certainly what I've been hearing is that most of the really interesting conversations, as often is the case, but I think especially so at this conference, weren't happening on the main stages. It was actually the plethora of side events, which, you know, you were all speaking at, where sort of the interesting conversations were happening. And Nick, you were involved in several parts of that, both in terms of the research summit, but also some work with the Pacific. So what was your sort of key takeout from the discussions?
I wanted +1 this point around it was a noticeable absence from the advocacy end of civil society, the more rights protecting and supporting end of civil society in terms of the main program. I will say from an AI safety perspective, Bletchley has failed in terms of creating a broad-based buy-in in the summit for discussing safety. The most intense safety discussions were, as you said, Johanna, outside the main venue, but there were still standard advocates and holdouts for AI safety. Yoshua Bengio, was there. Jan Talon, there was, Stuart Russell was going hard as well. And so there was still a little bit of space, people like Alondra and others who start to also slide into those kind of daily harms. They were there, but they were kind of noticeable by the rareness in a way that was quite interesting. But also, from what Meredith was saying before, also really contrasted to how strong and well organised those groups were outside the main venue. So the first 2 days where, Meredith, you brought a whole lot of also work and influence there from Tipti's work, was the MAP AI organised by the Global Network Initiative, a fantastic set of really coordinated and deep discussions about power and influence from global civil society into the space, which in itself is super valuable, right? So I think that the commitment to moving towards Switzerland from everyone that I've heard and spoken to since on this slightly more kind of right side of things is to actually, gosh, we have to, twist the arm of those bloody Swiss early to make sure that, despite the cost and distance, we'll actually get something here and something there. I was surprised by the fact that it was meant to be a kind of South-oriented event, and I didn't feel that the buy-in from or the engagement of the Pacific was at the right level. I felt that there was a little nod here and there, and obviously 89 signatories, as you said, to the declaration, a lot of economies signing up to that. But in terms of actually seeing anyone really on stage, fated, ask for their perspectives from smaller and nations and southern nations, again, the one exception was Philip Tego from Kenya, the special ambassador there to the president, who, Meredith, came out with all the talking points that you guys have been saying. Sovereignty is not about control, a kind of ownership, it's about agency. And it was really fantastic to see Philip flying the flag But I'm really hoping that as we move into next year, that outside organisation continues to, have influence and power, and then perhaps in Switzerland also gets recognised and legitimised in a way that will push back a little bit against that. It's just about the opportunities, the kind of Kratsios speech from the US side of things, the head of the Office of Science Technology Policy, who was very clear in saying any discussion of risk is bureaucratic nonsense. What we actually need to be doing is focusing on concrete opportunities, and we totally reject any form of global governance. I feel like we've gone quite far in that direction in the official program.
Yeah, it's disappointing, and you think we would have learnt some lessons, don't you? So just flagging there for people, the next conference will be held in Switzerland. What I find interesting about that is that it's being held almost back to back with Davos, which does not fill me with inspiration. But if anyone can bring together a multi-stakeholder community, it is the Swiss. So I'm not giving up hope, and it's incumbent on all of us here and all of our listeners to get engaged with that. Meredith, one of the conversations that we had as feedback was at the event that Nick was just talking about there, where there was a standing ovation for one of the civil society advocates. Maybe you can just briefly touch on what that was and what she got a standing ovation for, because I think that's an interesting reflection.
Yeah, thanks, Johanna. I'm really actually pleased to hear, Nick, that you, well, not pleased necessarily, but it's good to know that I wasn't the only one that picked up on that, because I do think that perhaps we could be framing this as an opportunity for the next years. There was definitely a lack of Asia-Pacific representation and voice. But I think, to pick up on your point there, Johanna, sometimes or recently there's been a fairly, but not just binary notion of sovereignty, but like a fairly black and white mood, I would say, across politics as a general, but particularly relating to tech policies. We've witnessed some of the global mechanics unfold. And I think in Australia, sometimes we absorb and consume a lot of very US-specific and perhaps EU-specific news. And so to sit there in that room at the MAP AI conference, it was a very refreshing experience to see some very impassioned speakers as well on the stage.
In case you're wondering, this event was held under Chatham House rule, and that's why Meredith is being careful not to name names here. But we are going to try and have this particular speaker come onto the pod as a guest in the near future, so watch this space.
She spoke just so passionately, basically, in terms of India and the South is not just a market for the West. There's an opportunity there for them to actually really leverage all of the incredible scale and depth of expertise that's already in play in these places, and to really stand up and work together. But there was an anger. It was an anger that was motivating. Like, it wasn't an anger that was necessarily, fatalistic. It was a real call to action, and the room was just going wild. Honestly, at the back of the room, I ended up messaging her after the session and just saying, I don't know if you could see up the back, but it was quite something how that was received.
Jess, what about for you from a key takeout perspective? What was one thing that you learnt that you didn't know before you went to Delhi that you've come away with?
I think there is a real passion for looking at the different intelligences and how we support the inclusion of community intelligence into the broader AI intelligence, and how we bring those together to make a positive social impact. I think that was definitely one of the really key things. And at the same time, because our focus as an organisation is on digital inclusion, that's still like 60% of the Indian population are not meaningfully connected. So there's all of this amazing passion and students everywhere and real interest in how this matters to India. But actually, still there is a significant issue with people just not even being properly connected, particularly in rural areas and particularly women. So I think that real need to continue that focus on just the basics is so key to all of the conversations that we're having, and to make sure that those people that, are the last mile. There's a lot of talk about the last mile and reaching the last mile of people that are not connected and that are not currently benefiting from some of this technology. I think that real need to focus on that continues. So it's not necessarily new, but I suppose it's a confirmation of what really needs to happen across all of these conversations. It's not just in India, but actually across the world.
Picking up on that reflection, Jess, of, the pace and the sophistication of the conversation around artificial intelligence, the different types of artificial intelligence, how it's transforming things. but also that disparity in how it's being received. Nick, for you, were there any big surprises out of the conference in terms of takeouts that you were like, I did not expect that, or that is a new perspective that my life is enriched by being exposed by that, which I think it's difficult to go to a conference like this and not have those moments. So which one stands out for you?
I think the biggest that stands out does relate back to our Pacific neighbours, because as you mentioned briefly earlier, we had the opportunity to bring together 9 digital leaders from across 6 Pacific nations at the Australian High Commission for a roundtable and a dinner. And that group actually, had been working together for a few days with the team at DFAT, with our amazing new Australia's Cyber Ambassador, Jess Hunter, who you know well.
She's excellent.
And so they've been working on this question of what is and what should be digital public infrastructure and how does that relate to AI. And I guess what was really gratifying was the kind of the commitment and the willingness to not get sucked into the hype and the marketing aspect of this, but to take it from the perspective of, we can see India doing this, we see Kenya doing that, we see other kind of Southeast Asian countries investing in different ways. But what do we need? And how does it play across the region so that we can share the fact that some of the countries are 20,000 people, right? Like some of the very, very tiny nations and like PNG and others, like, relative giants in the Pacific. But, shared overlapping cultures of isolation, really challenging access to telecommunications. Some of the Pacific Islands only got internet landed in the country in 2017. So these are big connectivity and accessibility issues that doesn't make any sense to say how you're going to use the large language models to reinvent public services. What it says is, what can we do together? How can we be flexible? And it was really fantastic to just be able to listen and have that conversation to deepen our understanding of where Australia can be a good neighbour in those engagements, but more importantly, to really just understand the conditions for investment in parts of the world where we take where Wi-Fi can't be taken for granted, let alone access to Claude or ChatGPT.
Yeah, and I think what I was hoping for more of out of the India Summit, because I think there's so many incredible stories of how India's taken a technology but built it at speed and scale at cost, right, that is affordable to these parts of the world that are never, the solutions that are coming out of the US, or frankly, sometimes even out of China, aren't going to meet the needs of these particular countries. Meredith, what about you? What was your surprising takeout?
I think what was surprising for me was trying to marry up these multiple conversations that I felt were happening. On the one side, we had the, large platforms for selling many amazing products, whether they be entrepreneurs or, big tech. And on the other side, we had these global South conversations happening. And I was looking for the parallels across them. And I felt very struck by the reality that I just think that sovereignty alone without institutional depth isn't really going to hold. And there's this notion of the state sort of being hollowed out that I think a lot of people are grappling to understand. So while there was significant momentum behind different layers of the AI stack, whether that be compute and infrastructure or the foundation models, etc., it's sovereignty or agency, as we've expanded that term, really needs to be exercised across all 6 layers, particularly across governance and standards. And there was far less attention being paid to whether public institutions had the depth to evaluate those layers in particular. So that probably ties back to Nick's comments around safety, certainly Lizzie's as well, but really just quite surprising how that we can talk at such a focused way around sustained investment into certain areas of that stack, but not necessarily the capability across the full stack itself. So governments can go out there and fund their own infrastructure or their own models, but as long as they have a lack of internal expertise to negotiate from a position of strength within that system, I was a bit surprised and sad to see that there wasn't a stronger understanding around the need to actually invest in that internal capability and to address the structural asymmetries internally.
Absolutely. And then with government and their citizens, right? And citizens' expectations of what government is doing. David, for you, what was the surprising takeout?
I think there was a real disparity between the public messaging and the private conversations. And so I think...
there often is, let's be honest.
But I think it really noticeably here, I mean, even for people that would say one thing publicly and quietly, they would say almost the opposite. to you. So I think that was interesting. I mean, it was also very gossipy. I mean, Bill Gates being pulled from the speakers list, Jensen Huang not turning up. I mean, there's a lot of sort of political intrigue about kind of what was going on and why one of those people was pulled and the other one didn't show up. So I think, the private conversations were far more fascinating than the actual public and summit events.
Lizzie?
So I suppose there's a couple of things, if I can abuse my position as a guest here. The first one is that it was held over Chinese New Year. So there wasn't this huge contingent of Chinese reps, whether they're industry or government, as compared, as I understand it, to previous summits. So people might remember Paris last year. There was this big confrontation where JD Vance comes along and basically tells Europe that he doesn't like them and they're going to have to do what he says, right? And Europe's, gets itself very upset and starts doing stuff in its own way as a result. That's my take on international affairs. Anyway, the point is this particular summit didn't quite reproduce that kind of international dialogue between superpowers. Maybe because of when it was timed, maybe there's other reasons, maybe some of that is now accepted and part of the furniture of discussing these topics in a way that at the time, at least at the last summit, the Trump administration was quite new. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning that is surprising, I mean, it's not really that surprising to me, but might be surprising to your listeners, is that basically everyone was talking about a social media ban for young people. So if you're Australian, you do have something to offer in these places because people want to talk to you about that. Politicians were falling over themselves to announce that they were pursuing it. Some of the nuance that we've argued for and you've covered in your podcast, Johanna, to a painstaking degree was not in those conversations. So how tech policy is made is often done to suit the agendas of politicians. I don't mean to sound cynical, but what I mean is if we want to have nuanced policy that does reflect evidence and harm and the interests of people, there's a lot of work to do. There are a lot of ways in which that can be circumvented. So that policy, some people love it, some people don't. I think there's a lot to it, but politicians clearly love making the announcement they're pursuing it. And that tells you a bit about how policy is made and what you've got to do if you've got a particular view on it that is different perhaps to the mainstream.
And I think my mission in 2026 is to try and avoid duty of care going the same way that the social media minimum age ban did. But let's see if I'm successful in that. I know there's a lot of other people who also have given themselves that mission, so it's not single-handedly. Jess, what was your surprising takeout? And then, folks, I'm going to do a round of what did you walk away with from this summit? And a resource that you found at the summit that you wouldn't otherwise have had. So just giving you the heads up that that's coming next. So Jess.
I think I talked a bit about it before, but I do think it's not so surprising, but it was really different to conferences I've been into it in Australia or in Europe. It's just about that passion that so many of the community had, and that I had exactly the same experience as others of people coming up to me and wanting to pitch something to me, even though they didn't even know who I was. So I do think that kind of real interest in how does this benefit not just the whole of the government or industry, but actually how does this benefit me? And how does this benefit my community? And how can I focus on supporting people to be able to participate? So I think, that energy of having students and civil society and community organisations from all over the world, but mostly from India, that real, we can do something and we're all here and we're going to try and make it happen, I think was probably the thing that was most surprising to me. At the same time and alongside that real need for connectivity as a key challenge for so much of the global south. And I keep kind of having this conversation about where Australia fits in the global south. Because technically we're in the south, but we're not in the global south. And technically we're in Asia Pacific, but nobody was talking about Australia. And so I think it's kind of really interesting about thinking about how do we take a role and what do we need to do in this space too.
I do think that we can do something about this. It's not a fatalistic perspective, but also we must. There is an obligation for us to actually take this stewardship role. And that's actually one of my favourite things about travelling to India is I always leave inspired because they actually do approach this from such a uniquely different way. And a part of the reason that I was so fascinated with them hosting the Safety Summit is that the last time I had been there, it was really the conversation was, can we stop talking about safety and harms and talk about the opportunity? Because we're trying to educate, 1 billion people. We're trying to feed. And so the conversation is just a different conversation in a different way of engaging with artificial intelligence. Not saying the risks aren't important, but actually the starting challenges are different challenges. And I think that is actually really important dimension in terms of the dynamism that they bring to the conversations. So Nick, for you, key outcome, like what was something that you achieved or that you feel was a deliverable out of the conference for you, and key resource?
I loved the fact that Australia was overrepresented relative to other nations in that research symposium. It was fantastic to have Li Mingzhu and me both on like a key top-level panel, and that was really gratifying, of course, to see how that highlighting where Australia's at in terms of AI regulation approach and some of the practical tools. I also really came away re-energised about the importance of really structured stakeholder engagement. I spent a lot of time thinking and talking about even the mathematical ways to kind of pull that out of research so that it's, quantifiable views. But the best resource was some of those, the Monday, Tuesday group of civil society leaders, Ellen from GNI, Jalak from the National Law University of Delhi, Isabella from Chatham House. The strength of that community, I think, is what's going to see through, particularly in the work that all of us care about, which is that human impact.
Yeah, definitely a +1 to all of those names, but in particular Jalak, who Tipti has had the pleasure of working with, and I think carried so much in the last few months in terms of pulling together various different components. David, for you, what was your key outcome?
I think the conversation shifted from sort of this hypothetical existential risk to really more tangible impacts. And I think there was a big conversation around what does this mean for human capital? What does this mean for the future of work? Like, what's the role for humans in all of this? And I think particularly in the Global South, where the focus is very much on education and uplifting, and the point you made as well, Johanna, like, using technology to elevate people. I think there's a question about, like, is AI going to help do that, or is it going to be a problem, going forward? So I think that's a live conversation. The one resource, it wasn't actually at the summit, but post the summit, I'd recommend Andrew Charlton's speech to the Australian Business Economists conference yesterday, so the 24th of February, which I'm sure was influenced by what he experienced in Delhi. And so I think it's a pretty sensible and balanced discussion of the global economics of play and where Australia's strategic advantage potentially lies, particularly in the nexus between the energy and infrastructure and the software and services layer, and the need to ensure that we, and most importantly Australian workers, capture the benefits. And I think it's inherent that we move quickly to assert our agency over those areas. So I think it was a good contribution.
Yeah, we'll pop a link to that speech in the pod notes. It was really heartening to see that, and also heartening that a lot of the terminology he's using there are really resonating with the standalone research that Tipti has done as well. So it's always nice to see that flowing through. Meredith, on that note, what was your key takeout or resource?
I'm also going to go with, I'll start, it's very selfishly, I suppose, Johanna, being able to socialise the TIPD from AI Sovereignty to AI Agency report was just so great. It's not often in your life that you've had the opportunity to contribute to a paper that firstly defines AI at all into 6 layers and 101 classifications, but to have, senior advisors from Oxford University confirm that from their perspective it's world leading and that there's nothing else as robust of that they've seen anywhere was quite a self-gratifying moment, I won't lie. And it was really exciting to see just how many people wanted a copy.
Yeah, you had people with scissors cutting it up at one point, didn't you? It was pretty outrageous. Yeah.
So that was a very selfish highlight. The typology itself is just the baseline to being able to perform the assessment and actually enact the tool itself and have a more nuanced conversation around agency. But yeah, that definition was great. And perhaps just to end on a fun one, I'm going to out myself as being a ginormous nerd, with full caveat that
I feel like you're in good company there.
The full disclosure is that TIPD is actually just about to launch a new project with Lego called the Tech Policy Youth Ambassadors program. But this particular observation is entirely my own and entirely due to my own love of Lego. But they've designed a new program that builds skills progressively for kids across computer science concepts. So the kids start out by imagining and building their very own Lego robot, as you would imagine. But then they get to work in groups to actually code and experiment with it through curriculum-aligned lessons that help introduce and socialise the concepts for children around probability, bias, machine representation. So they get to train with simple models. They get to unpack the notions around misclassifications and begin to therefore understand how AI works itself through hands-on, teacher-friendly, privacy-first and classroom-contained experiences. So this is not a product plug, I really want to say, but it is a healthy reminder, I think, for me, that AI literacy doesn't have to mean embedding children into commercial forms. We can not only equip kids with capability, but actually they're more than capable of grasping what many adults, myself included, might treat as magic, and I know what my nephews are getting for Christmas.
Awesome. Who haven't I asked this question of? I've lost track. Lizzie and Jess. So let's go Lizzie, then Jess.
Yeah, I have to reserve my judgment a bit, right? Because I went along and I felt like there's not enough of a role that civil society is playing in some ways, but also like, is this a good use of my time? Like, I've got a lot to do back in my own country, right? And maybe I shouldn't be coming along to something that isn't really designed for me, right? I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I just mean as a way you allocate your time and energy as an advocate. And I had thought maybe that these summits would be more like eventually over time, like a COP, like a conference of parties on climate change, where you have this kind of side festival going on where civil society advocates get together and put forward proposals, like states are talking and stuff. And I'm not sure it's really there, right, in that way. It's maybe that it becomes like that. It's going to be interesting to see how Switzerland runs it. Maybe I have to go another time and check. But the point I'm making is that it is tricky to know whether to engage with these in some ways. Sometimes the worst thing is not being in the room, right? But other times it is a huge investment of resources in circumstances where there might be other places to put that. So I'm trying to reflect on that and work out what I might do next time, whether we want to do something else instead. I would just say, I don't know if I'm going on too long here, but I had a day when all the big heads of state were in town, so no one's allowed into the conference centre. And I went and saw my friend who's a civil rights lawyer in India. She was making submissions in the Supreme Court of India on that day, and she took me along to watch. And she's on her feet arguing in defence of civil rights in India. And I thought to myself, oh, maybe litigation, which is my other life, right, is one of the key ways you make change. She's advocating for equality and freedom from discrimination based on religion in real time. And that brought home to me that there are lots of ways in which you can influence these processes politically. This is one, but there might be more direct ones, and we've all got to work out how to use our skills to their greatest strength, I suppose, is how I describe it, to make sure that that process is working. And so I want to be involved in the process. Maybe this is where it's at, but I'm not necessarily sure that it is. But I might reserve my judgment for a little bit longer.
Yeah, and I do wonder if it's a structural thing as well. So I definitely think Australia needs to be at this conference. It's really important that we're there and present, but maybe it's actually encouraging the government to have more consultation with civil society before it goes, so that it's like reframing it in that way, so creating opportunities. Nick, was that you wanting to jump in with something there?
Just wanted to say that to the point about what happens at home domestically for all the countries that were present while the AI Summit was going on, pretty much in the same week that the Secretary of the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House was saying we reject kind of global governance and, you know, any regulation is a drag on opportunity. 4 separate US states passed either through the House or out of committee. Really critical policy movements on AI, companions and laws proposal around addiction, into laws that frankly China's had on the books for a long time. But these states are moving, and to kind of take a signal about the kind of cross-country, cross-national scene from this one conference when, as Lizzie said, there are people fighting every day through courts, litigation in committees and parliaments. Yeah, it's important to look down and see where that real impact is happening as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jess, with the closing observations in terms of key output and any resource.
I just would say again that I think there were really good examples in the sessions I was at about the use of AI and to benefit real issues. So there were, Digital Green is looking at how they support farmers to better prepare for disasters by using their information as well as predictions for climate around where flooding might happen. Like that kind of thing is really helpful to people and the lives that they're living. And so it's actually ultimately about the outcomes that we're looking for. What are we trying to create here? Not just the use of the tools. And so I think there were really, really interesting examples of how that's actually happening now. And it is really benefiting people and their lives. So I think that definitely was one of them. Also, again, I'm really interested in this. How do we make sure that there is a a broader collective intelligence being used, not just out of all of the large language models. So how do we kind of collect those two together? And there was a really interesting organisation, Collective Intelligence Project, that is doing global dialogues, that is bringing together people from all over the world. I think they've done like 70 countries, lots and lots of different people. Only issue is you have to be online, so that's one of the challenges for it. But definitely is looking at how do we make sure that there's broader conversations happening, broader people investing in this information, in the large language models and how we use the AI. So it's not just about the use of the people that are already in the space. So that would collective intelligence model, and you can download their data. It's really awesome. So
awesome. I love ending on a positive note. So that is also really good. I think by the sounds of it, a fantastic experience for people to be on the ground, and perhaps some questions in terms of how this needs to be shaped to be impactful. I am optimistic for what the Swiss might be able to do with this. They've got the muscle memory for it. So we'll be watching very closely. Thank you so much for all of you for generously giving your time in this somewhat chaotic, but I think wonderful insight into what it was like in Delhi on the ground. And we hope to see you all on the podcast again sometime soon. And keep doing the extraordinary work that you are all doing, because it is making a difference. Thank you. Well, that's it for this episode of Tech Mirror, which is brought to you by the Tech Policy Design Institute. We're based here in Canberra on the lands of the Ngunnawal Ngambri people. If you found today's conversation useful or thought-provoking, please do share it with a friend or a colleague, or leave a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching, please don't forget to like and follow. For show notes, you can visit techpolicy.au/podcast. And this podcast was made possible with thanks to the generous contributions from government, industry and philanthropy to the Tech Policy Design Fund, the full details of which are available on our website. The team at Audiocraft produced this pod on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and Amy Denmaid provided invaluable research support. Music is by Talia Skopelis. A big thank you also to the team at the Tech Policy Design Institute, without whom this pod would not be possible. Thank you for joining us. And as always, get in touch and get involved.